What's up, Sushi Squad? We are back for more. Whoop. Totally meant to do that on purpose. How y'all doing today, ladies and gentlemen? We're going to be doing the 45K series continued, but today we're going to be doing the Knight of all things. Now, those of you that don't know, this class is a bit of a powerhouse. Surprising, I know. But the weird thing is that devs don't really have a full grasp of what is actually like efficiently strong in this game. And so unfortunately, after the more recent updates, the Knight's most powerful output of damage is the base attack. Like, legitimately, you are lowering the amount of damage you do if you end up using your classroom ability or your slam down. It's kind of hilarious. Now, the other thing to consider is that we are going to end up having quite a bit of extra movement speed because I've got some in the Grand Orrery. Granted, I don't have like the movement speed that's up here, but I do have all these other nice movement speed buffs and so on and so forth. So we've actually got a pretty handy 121 movement speed at base value. Now, that would be slightly increased if I had a C4 melee weapon, which I never really went out of my way to end up farming one of those. And then another thing that I want to mention is that I only am rocking a C1 ring. Now, Overcharge is going to end up being the best ability. Let me actually hop into my club world so I can kind of explain this to you guys very briefly before we end up doing our damage, check and analysis and blah, blah, blah. But essentially, Overcharge is going to make it so that we have an increased movement speed based on using our charge attack, which is going to end up being our #1. So, unfortunately, I had to waste some Paragon levels so that I could do this for you guys, but hey, whatever. So, let's take a quick peek. So, 121 movement speed goes up to a staggering 146, and that buff lasts quite a while. Now, the problem is that we would have to use that attack in the middle of combat, which of course is going to end up negating the amount of damage total that we would do. So for today's video, that's what we're going to do. We're going to be using our main class gem ability. However, the most ideal way that you can build the Knight right now is by still containing his dash, I would say, just because of the fact that you can kind of spam this and it's a decent amount of movement speed. It can end up really helping you get out of a jam. But for today's video, we're just going to end up using the class gem ability itself, because as far as my logic is concerned, we're still outputting damage, which is better than us doing the dash, because the dash is fundamentally broken and has been since day one, where it'll get caught on enemies and break a bunch of your graphics and stuff with the characters. It's really, really annoying. So we're not going to be going into Geode Surface today. We're just primarily going to be in Sundered Uplands U11. Now, the thing to consider is that if we can handle this area, we can handle pretty much every area, because these are the strongest enemies in the entire game. Now, one last thing to consider is that in the Celestial skill tree, I do have the Life Leech ability, which does mean that we could technically swap off Death Defying, but it's not really that big of a deal. And then otherwise, I'm still going to be using Lunacy, just because when it triggers, we can end up getting big mode, gives us more movement speed, so on and so forth. But for the most part, the Solarian subclass ability is probably going to be your best option in terms of dealing damage. Now, Power Rank does say in the patch, the most recent patches, that it goes up to like 40 kpr in terms of the buff that you end up getting, but that's not actually true. It still only goes up to 30k. I'm guessing that there's a line of code that the devs ended up forgetting about. Let me make sure. So I got bombs on my hotbar and stuff. Let's go. So we're gonna be doing five minutes worth of dungeons, and I just want to show you the raw damage without using a flask. Not bad. Our survivability is through the roof because of that life steal. Again, these are going to end up being the strongest enemies in the game, so you do have to be kind of wary of that, just because any other area we're going to be doing fine. It's the way that the Sundered Uplands enemies deal with scaling. So the funny thing is that if we end up going into a normal biome in U11, the enemies are going to end up being destroyed relatively quickly, and Geode Surface is actually going to end up being destroyed even faster, because the way that the enemies scale in this game, whoopsie daisy, I gotta get used to actually running around on foot. The way the enemies end up scaling in this game is they will actually end up having more resistance to your light the higher tiered they are. So it's kind of a weird one, because it's like the Sundered Uplands enemies are just the strongest because there's a bunch of debuffs that the player has on us. And then, you know, with Geode Surface, those enemies were designed around the light functionality, and so they are thus the most susceptible to light, which is why we are, like, so absolutely strong in those areas. But, I mean, as you can see, Knight is perfectly fine. Lots of people underestimate this class. I think most of all just because the class is kind of boring now. Like, Knight mains, I feel your pain, although at the same time, it's kind of fun just having like one of the laziest characters in the entire game where you barely have to put in any gameplay input to be successful, you know? Like, there's just something about it that's kind of like, oh look, the Knight is at its peak. Now let's talk in terms of feedback of how is the class going to fare versus other classes. Well, you can already see that the Knight is going to end up handling these end game areas quite well. I should also, instead of using Chromatic, I should be using Trailblazing just because of that extra movement speed. But we're dealing enough damage. And we are also going to end up, there we go, we're dealing enough damage, but we're also going to end up having a decent amount of movement speed, because the way that speed is going to be calculated in this game essentially is, okay, well, you got two options for your classes. You either have to deal so much damage that you get through the dungeon as quickly as possible, or you have to have enough movement speed that you can travel between dungeons as quickly as possible. So this is going to end up being a normal 3-star dungeon boss. You can see he was quite tanky, but not nearly as tanky as a normal Sundered Uplands dungeon. Now, the thing is with the Knight, he's kind of in the middle point. He doesn't really have a lot of movement speed, as you can see. You know, we can kind of do it, but not really that great. And he also doesn't really have the maximum amount of damage. Now, the funny thing is that the Knight can end up being significantly stronger if I ended up obviously having ideal gear. If I ended up having a C4 melee weapon, and if I ended up having a C4 ring, then we might actually be quite the contender in terms of dealing damage. Right? I am also using my permatorch and everything like that, so we are almost ideal, and at the very least you can say that, okay, you can easily solo U11. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit tricky to say, oh, everyone's going to be able to solo U11 because my stats are really, really cracked. But on top of that, we also have the star chart abilities, the skill tree abilities of the lifesteal, which again gives us insane survivability no matter what class we're playing on. And then also the extra movement speed, which is just going to end up having quite a significant impact on, once again, every class, not just the Knight. Now, it is going to end up being an interesting thing for me to try and grind the class to maximum. I'm going to admit to you guys, I don't really have a goal of getting every class maxed out by any means. But hey, whatever. The other thing too is, ideally, since we do have the lifesteal, we would probably, rather than using Death Defying, we would use Conjurer's Crucible, just because, let me show you kind of the example of this. So if we end up triggering Magic Find, we actually have a chance of recovering a flask, which means that we could thus farm for a lot longer, because we're kind of reliant on using our flasks, as you can see, in order to end up dealing heaps and heaps of damage. And so having the Conjurer's Crucible Vial means that we essentially, can you get out of the way, stupid dungeon? We essentially are going to end up increasing our pots while grinding without running out like we were with Death Defying, and thus having to kind of go all the way back to Rejuvenation Station or so on and so forth. So it's pretty consistent, although it does have a little bit of a cooldown as far as I know. Either way, I think that's a pretty good example of just how powerful this class can end up being in terms of U11 Sundered Uplands. I think that's one of the big things that I enjoy so much about like the Shadowhunter update, was that they ended up making a lot of characters have movement abilities, and just generally speaking, they became a lot more viable just in terms of their functionality and so on. So what I'm going to actually attempt doing right now, I mean, Lunar Lancer might still be a better subclass ability, but personally, I think I would always end up taking the extra light value just because it's going to give us a lot more damage, and probably would have even been a lot more damage for the Sundered Uplands, but hey, whatever. Now, unfortunately, we are just going to be in depth 136 because it's the easiest, quickest portal that I have right now, and I have an abundance of them. And you gotta consider that I need to do a lot of 45k videos. You know, I gotta have a lot of different characters going into all of these delves and so on and so forth, which is kind of a shame, because as you can see, we decimate anything at 136 now just because of the fact that we have so much more power. Unfortunately, the only depth that it starts becoming slightly difficult is around the 140s and up. And even then, that's just in terms of a class trying to solo that depth. So one thing that I know a lot of you guys, you know, are very aware of is when we end up doing these videos and I end up going into the delves, I kind of talk about like how the character is going to handle the delves based on how much they can end up soloing the area. And I know that that's not going to end up being a realistic example for a lot of you guys that are probably going to play with friends or play in a group. However, my argument is that a lot of the functionality of a class in delves is not actually going to change that much based on whether you are solo or with a group, because obviously if you are going to be able to solo the area, then chances are you're going to be able to handle it in a group. And Knight is not one of those characters that I would say is particularly great at the delves right now in comparison to some of the other more powerful classes like Ice Sage, Solarian, and so on and so forth. However, we actually have a pretty significant damage reduction on this class that we didn't have before. So when we use our ultimate ability, they actually changed it now so it does negate 25% damage. And as far as I know, I'd have to double check the numbers, but as far as I know, it will actually negate 25% on all party members that are nearby and end up gaining the benefit of us using the ult. Now, it does mean that we ourselves as the Knight are going to take a little bit more damage, but as we've already seen with the Life Leech, that doesn't really matter too much, and worst case scenario, you would just end up swapping over to Death Defying, which technically speaking, I should probably be using right now just for safety measures, right? But anyways, that's going to end up being the delve itself, which you can see is absolutely no problem. This is going to end up being our example of fighting against a boss, which fighting against a boss is going to end up being a little bit different just because, unfortunately, again, the Knight's most optimal amount of damage is just going to end up being the base attack. So there's not really much we can do outside of this static amount of damage towards the boss. There's not really any bursts or anything that we could end up focusing on doing, because the slam down, though it does end up causing quite a bit of damage, it leaves us vulnerable. It takes a long time to end up actually working. Like, I think if the slam down actually was calculated with attack speed so that the animation would end up being significantly faster, that would be fantastic. In fact, a lot of classes would end up seeing huge benefits to their side abilities if attack speed was taken into account for the animation. Obviously, it would require a lot of tweaking on the classes in the game, just because so many classes would actually become broken, because if we could potentially spam this ability, obviously that would end up being really powerful, because it's not really an ability that is intended on doing something like that. But anyways, let's give a quick brief summary of the class. What do I think about it? I think that you can main the Knight for pretty much anything in the game. It's not going to be a fantastic boss killer. It's not going to end up being fantastic for speed farming, but it is going to be functional. It is a possibility to use it for either or, especially if you are strong enough, then it's frankly not really going to matter which class you choose. You're always going to end up just choosing your favorite. That's what I would recommend. But in terms of, okay, is there other classes that are better than the Knight? Oh, most definitely. There are a lot of classes that do specific category functions a lot better than the Knight. And in fact, I would say that the Shadow Hunter is actually a very good jack of all trades character. Like, the Boomeranger is kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, whereas the Shadow Hunter is like the higher quality version of that. So Shadow Hunter can be used very effectively for boss killing, decent for speed farming, way better than the Knight though by comparison. So that's kind of the thing, is what do you want to end up doing with your time in Trove? Do you want to end up speed farming, in which case you would just use a Neon Ninja or Lunar Lancer or other faster classes? Or do you want to end up using a class as a boss killer specifically? Or do you just enjoy the Knight? You know, doing this all the time. But anyways, thanks so much for watching, gamers. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed. Today we've got the Game of the Year awards, so if you didn't end up checking out the scheduled live stream, it's going to be in a couple hours from now. I'm going to try to get this video out to you guys as soon as possible. Really excited for it. I hope you guys can tune into that, but if you don't, I actually have my own Game of the Year awards video already out, and I'm very proud of that video. I spent weeks editing it. So hopefully you guys end up watching it. I would recommend it. I think that it was really, really well done, if I do say so, because I just, you know, I watched through it, edit it over and over and over again. And it's probably one of my best videos, I think, anyways, just in terms of how much time and effort I put into it. So I'm just letting you guys know that that was a labor of love video. But anyways, we also have new merch, so you guys can check that out. It is a limited time. This merch is only going to be available until January 1st, and then it is gone until more than likely next year. I am trying to order samples for myself, but they probably won't arrive in time for me to show you guys what it looks like. And I know it's quite expensive, but it is a all over print, which is inherently just expensive. There's nothing I can do about the price. I've made it as cheap as I possibly can. The rest of the money, most of all, is going to go into producing it and making it, right? But anyways, smash like, sub for more, buy the merch you want, support the channel, and have a wonderful day, everybody.